Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Whiting. I'm the Dean. I welcome you this evening. A quick reminder that we have live captioning available. There's a QR code. Those always drive me crazy, but apparently they work. And our online audience, there's a little CC button at the bottom of the screen. Please visit the AV booth if you have any questions. So this is an exciting jam-packed week at the GSD. Today marks the start of the Walking Festival of Sound, which runs through May 3rd. And is curated by Loeb and Art Lab fellow Jacek Smolinki. Jacek, you're here, I think, right? I saw you walk in. There you are. Please visit their gorgeous website, WFOS, which is walkingfestivalofsound.net, for more information. Tomorrow, as part of the Harvard University Arts Thursdays initiative, the GSD will host artist Michael Wang, who will discuss his work at the intersection of nature and technology. And then next Tuesday, April 21st, Jacques Herzog, founding partner of Herzog and de Meuron, will join in conversation with Grace Law, our chair of architecture here at the school. For more information, please visit our website. So I'm simply thrilled to welcome Nancy Fraser to the GSD as our Spring 2026 Senior Loeb Scholar. Since its inception in 2010, the Senior Loeb Scholar Program has offered the GSD community opportunities to learn from visionary designers, practitioners, and scholars during a uniquely focused week-long visit that includes a public lecture and multiple direct engagements with GSD students, faculty, staff, researchers, and Loeb Fellows. Let me take this moment to thank Susan Mahoney, Program Director of the Loeb Fellowship, who's done a masterful job of scheduling Nancy's time here. I've seen the schedule. It's only day 3, and already she's had separate sessions with our architecture thesis students, PhD students, MDes public students, among others. She'll also be speaking tomorrow at 4 p.m. at the Center for European Studies Questions of Fascism and Democracy lecture series. An academic and activist both, Nancy Fraser is the Henry and Louise A. Loeb, we promise that's not why we chose you, but it's convenient, Loeb Professor Emerita of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research and a member of the Editorial Committee of New Left Review. Trained as a philosopher, she specializes in critical social theory and political philosophy. She's the author of Cannibal Capitalism, How Our System is Devouring Democracy, Care, and the Planet, published in 2022, and The Old is Dying and the New Cannot Be Born, 2019, among other titles. While both of these titles are captivating, you might infer from them that their author is a maven of doom and gloom. Fear not. Fraser never sugarcoats reality, but her writing always does offer a modicum of hope. She's a role model, producing incredibly thorough, careful critiques that always project us forward. She's been a role model for me ever since I was a doctoral student, which was when I first read her essay, Rethinking the Public Sphere, a contribution to the critique of actually existing democracy. For me, this was a deeply liberating essay, recasting Jürgen Habermas's concept of the public sphere into a collection of multiple publics. What had been a single hermetic sphere turned into, in my mind at least, a collection of overlapping umbrellas, fostering multiple defined yet contingent identities. I've been reading her work ever since then, appreciating her methodical, inspiring analyses of capitalism, democracy, social justice, and feminism, among other topics. I wanted her to come here as our Senior Loeb Scholar this year for many reasons. I've already revealed the first, which is my selfish one. I've been a fangirl for several decades now. Additionally, Fraser offers a timely reminder to all of us of the value of close reading and critical thinking. With this talk, we will all reap the rewards of her academic rigor, which is ever more valuable at this moment of short attention spans and AI summaries. Third, if you read Fraser's writing, you'll note that oftentimes it comes in the form of dialogues or conversations. She'll respond to others and will advance work through interviews, as she's doing with us all week. She's modeling how intellectual work advances through exchange. And this is a good moment to let you all know there's a Q&A period at the end, so start queuing up those cues right now. Fourth, her approach to democracy, to all of her topics, is to find and dissect intellectual overlaps. Capitalism, democracy, the economy, the state, the political. She reveals that all of these entities are imbricated parts of an ever-evolving social totality. She's one of the most synthetic thinkers I've ever read. She charts the intersections of fields while never losing the depth of knowledge of each one. Every one of our disciplines and professions at the GSD demands similar synthetic thinking. Our design and planning fields are affected by, and in turn affect economics, politics, technology, social realms, and so on. Learn from Fraser tonight how one can navigate such complexity without succumbing to making things more complicated. Finally, and this reason speaks to the topic we'll be hearing about tonight, we find ourselves today at what seems to be an impossible moment in history. We're facing economic, social, political, and ecological crises that are simply unimaginable. Disparities, inequities ravage our entire globe. It's hard to have hope, and yet I think it's one of our obligations, both as designers and as academics, to traffic in some degree of optimism. We say that the Graduate School of Design, quote, educates leaders in design, research, and scholarship to make a resilient, just, and beautiful world. That's hard to do, and right now that seems harder than ever. Nancy Fraser's talk this evening is not going to suggest that it's easy, but let's listen to her talk against the environmentalism of the rich to learn how we can all approach the challenge with care, with intelligence, and with a view forward. Thank you, Nancy, for all your generosity this week as our senior Loeb scholar.
Thank you so much, Dean Whiting, for that absolutely, well, overwhelming introduction. It's a lot to live up to, but what better place than here to try, anyway. And I'm honored to be the senior Loeb visiting fellow this semester, and very grateful to everyone who had a hand in selecting me for this honor and in organizing this visit. You, Dean Whiting, thank you so much, to the Loeb Fellowship itself, and to Susan Mahoney, who, as you say, did a crackerjack job of putting it all together. Thank you all, and thank the rest of you for coming. Well, let me get right to it. Until recently, climate denialism seemed dead in the water. Now, however, it is back, indeed, with a vengeance. Last year, President Trump called global warming a hoax and a con job. Just yesterday, the New York Times reported that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had just dismissed well-founded scientific evidence of anthropogenic planetary heating as elite beliefs. These pronouncements are not just rhetorical flourishes, but they reflect actual shifts in policy. The administration has axed most of its predecessors' renewable energy projects and is actively seeking to end restrictions on greenhouse gas emissions and to ramp up domestic production of fossil fuels. Having essentially gutted the EPA, it is fast-tracking pipelines and opening large wilderness tracts to drilling. Certainly, the US is ground zero for climate denialism, but it is hardly the only hotspot. A Stanford study released last year documented growing resistance to climate action across the globe and argued that such resistance had become a, quote, global movement. Certainly, this movement is largely shaped by energy and agricultural interests, which are jointly responsible for more than half of global greenhouse gas emissions. But its claims are increasingly framed in populist terms, both economic and cultural. Climate action is now portrayed as a threat not only to jobs and livelihoods, but also to cultural identity and ways of life, including even traditional gender roles. As Besant's reference to elite beliefs suggests, climate denialism is now being integrated into a global wave of reactionary populism that purports to address a broad civilizational crisis. Voicing multiple grievances, its partisans invite vast populations who are struggling with deteriorating life conditions to blame their woes on cultural elites and to make common cause with extractive corporate interests. Environmentalists are rightly alarmed. In this situation, many are inclined instinctively to focus on building a big green tent. Hoping to fend off the flames, they lean to a strategy that would unite ecological currents of all stripes in a broad anti-denialist front, while muting disagreements among them and muzzling so-called non-ecological concerns. That response is fully understandable, to be sure, but in my view, it is badly mistaken for several reasons. Strategically, the big green tent approach plays into the fossil populist trap. It effectively embraces single-issue environmentalism and fails to validate real harms that appear to many who suffer them to have no connection to climate change. It is effectively what I'll be calling here an environmentalism of the rich. It invites the charge of elitism. In addition, this approach forecloses a momentous question: which environmentalism can really save the planet? With that question off the table, it will be almost certainly answered, at least sotto voce, in a way that suits the most powerful segments in our society, including those progressive neoliberals, as I've called them, who paved the way for Trump and who champion green capitalism. Then the likely result of their triumph will be, I claim, to destroy the planet just as surely by another route. In this lecture, then, I will be arguing that single-issue environmentalism cannot save the planet. What is needed, rather, is what I'll call a subaltern environmentalism, which links the defense of nature to the emancipation of human beings. To make that case, I'll defend two theses. First, ecopolitics should be anti-capitalist, and second, it should be, coining a term, trans-environmental, that is, linked to class struggles for livelihood security and labor rights, for affordable housing and childcare, for quality education and healthcare, for migrant and minority rights, anti-sexism and anti-racism, peace and human rights. To support those propositions, I'm going to offer a mix of arguments, some conceptual, some historical, some political. First, however, a remark on terminology. The phrase in my title, the environmentalism of the rich, inverts an expression coined by Jean Martinez Allier, namely the environmentalism of the poor. In his book of that title, the expression refers to the struggles of poor communities, mainly, but not only in the global South, against neo-imperial corporate assaults on their natural surroundings and communities. The objects of their struggle, according to Martinez Allier, is not to defend capital and nature in the abstract, but to protect habitats that are inextricably entwined with their ways of life, their sources of livelihood, community, social reproduction, and political identity. In other words, the environmentalism of the poor, as Martinez Allier presents it, is integrated, bringing together a whole set of existential concerns. Rather than separate out harms to non-human nature, capital N, it treats these as deeply entangled with harms to human communities. By contrast, what I am here calling the environmentalism of the rich is single-issue environmentalism. Environmentalism as nature defense, uncontaminated by any other extraneous concerns such as social justice, livelihood security, democracy, social reproduction of human communities. Now, these concerns appear extraneous only to those whose livelihoods, political rights, and community survival are not existentially threatened. Just as I've argued that single-issue feminism can only be a feminism of the 1%, so single-issue environmentalism can only be an environmentalism of the rich. In both cases, what purports to be an emancipatory movement actually represents the interests of a small elite and is therefore, you could say, a political gift to Scott Bessent and Donald Trump. Both those expressions, the environmentalism of the poor and the environmentalism of the rich, have populist overtones. Rich and poor are populist surrogates for class categories, on a par with terms like the 99% and the 1% terms that I myself have used. Like all populist language, these terms are simplified and lacking in analytical precision, but they have great mobilizing power, in part because they direct our attention to the social formation in which eco-politics plays out. These terms rightly suggest that this is a deeply unjust social formation in which a relatively small number of humans live comfortably and long, while the vast majority suffer and die young. But of course, everything depends on how precisely we understand that social formation and the fault lines that cross it. Denialist populism assumes a tripartite picture in which the virtuous people are squeezed between the predatory elites at the top and the freeloading underclass at the bottom. Caught in a kind of pincers movement, the people lash out at science and migrants, progressives and Muslims, feminists and vaccines, while turning for help to fossil interests who are primed by design to betray them. Another better option would embrace a two-tiered picture of society in which capital, or rather those dedicated to accumulating it, exploit and expropriate the rest of us while also trashing nature. That second view is the one I'm going to argue for here, both because it better clarifies the actual dynamics of planetary heating and their entanglement with other pressing threats to human beings, and because it suggests a political strategy that might actually defeat denialism and save the planet. So let me begin by proposing that the proper name for our social formation is an old familiar one, namely capitalist society, which, it turns out, is also the system that has brought us global warming. Contra those who speak of anthropogenic climate change, I maintain, along with a number of other left-wing ecological theorists, that the principal agent of planetary heating is not humanity in general, but the small class of entrepreneurs, investors, and their political enablers who have engineered and profited from the system of production, transport, and communication that is bombarding the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. They haven't done this contingently, moreover. It's not the result of some freak accident. Rather, they've been strongly incentivized to do so by the design of a social system that gives them means, motive, and opportunity to savage the planet. Let me briefly recap this argument, which I made more fully in my 2022 book, which Dean Whiting mentioned, Cannibal Capitalism. Capitalist societies, I claim, split what they call the economy off from the latter's non-economic background conditions that make an economy possible, conditions that include nature. At the same time, these societies established a contradictory relation between those realms, if that's the right word, between the economy and nature. On the one hand, the accumulation of capital relies on nature, both as a so-called tap, which supplies material and energetic inputs to commodity production, and as a so-called sink for absorbing the latter's waste. But on the other hand, the system's design incentivizes owners bent on maximizing profits to commandeer what they think of as nature's gifts as cheaply as possible, while absolving them of any obligation to replenish what they take or repair what they damage. Premised on the false assumption that nature can replenish itself autonomously and without end, capitalist society rests on a predatory, extractive relation to it, consuming ever more biophysical wealth in order to pile up ever more profits. What piles up as well, of course, and not accidentally, is an ever-growing mountain of eco-wreckage. And this is depicted in a rather interesting way by the Senegalese photographer Fabrice Monteiro. Okay. Now, the point I just made can also be formulated differently in terms of class power. By definition, capitalist societies devolve to capital, or again, rather, to those dedicated to its accumulation, the task of organizing production. It's the class of capitalists whom this system licenses to extract raw materials, generate energy, determine land use, engineer food systems, bioprospect medicinals, dispose of waste, and I suppose I should add here, to build buildings and finance architectural works. So the system effectively cedes to this class the lion's share of control over air and water, soil and minerals, flora and fauna, forests and oceans, atmosphere and climate, which is to say over all the basic conditions that sustain life on Earth. Capitalist societies, in other words, vest a class that is strongly motivated to trash nature with the power to manage our relations with it. Whichever way we state it, the point is the same. There is an ecological contradiction lodged at the heart of capitalist society in the relation this society establishes between economy and nature. The contradiction is structural, I claim, built into the system's very design. And that means that we cannot save the planet without disabling some core constitutive features of that system, above all, the deeply implanted imperative to unlimited accumulation of capital. So that's the argument for my first thesis. An environmentalism that might actually save the planet has got to go after capitalism. But that is not all. Capitalism's ecological contradiction is entangled with several others, which are equally structural and deeply entrenched. These, too, precipitate crises and struggles which entwine with the ecological. A case in point is capitalism's social reproductive contradiction, which is rooted in the system's gendered divide between commodity production on the one hand and unpaid or underpaid care work on the other, social reproduction. In this arrangement, production presupposes reproduction, which forms and replenishes the system's human subjects, including the paid workers from whom capital extracts surplus value. Yet capital accords care work little, if any, monetized value. It treats it as free and infinitely available and assumes no responsibility for sustaining it. Capitalist society is therefore inherently prone to destabilize social reproduction, just as it tends, non-accidentally, to destabilize natural ecosystems. In fact, the two processes are hard to separate. When capital destabilizes the ecosystems that support human habitats, it simultaneously jeopardizes social reproduction and caregiving, as well as individual livelihoods, as well as the livelihoods and social relations that sustain them. When people fight back, conversely, it's often to defend the entire social nexus at a single stroke, as if to defy the authority of capitalism's divisions. Crises of nature and crises of care are intertwined. The effects are especially acute for populations whom capitalist expansion has rendered politically defenseless. The system develops in part by annexing chunks of nature for whose reproduction costs it does not pay, or pays as little as possible, as I've just said. In appropriating nature, however, capital simultaneously expropriates human communities for whom the confiscated material and befouled surrounds constitute a habitat, their means of livelihood, the material basis of their social reproduction. Now, these communities are mostly situated on the wrong side of the global color line. Enslaved by conquest and dispossessed by debt, they've been deprived of the means to defend themselves, including effective state protections and actionable rights. Set up, as it were, for ongoing plunder, populations of color bear a hugely disproportionate share of the global environmental load. Their exposure affords other, whiter communities the chance to be sheltered, at least for a while, from the worst effects of capital's cannibalization of nature. The system's built-in tendency to ecological crisis is therefore tightly linked to its built-in imperializing thrust, which creates racially marked populations for expropriation. Now, the same holds for capital's appropriation of labor more broadly. The system works by forming and deforming labor in all of its guises, whether productive or reproductive, expropriated or exploited. And this could not be otherwise, given that nature and labor are internally related. I don't mean only that human laborers are themselves biosocial beings, hence part of nature, although of course we are. I mean also that nature is a fundamental condition of labor, supplying the material substrate that labor transforms. The so-called raw materials, the productive and reproductive inputs, including land, tools, machines, people, and other animals. In addition, nature supplies the energy that powers labor, including both the foodstuffs originating from biomass, whose digestion powers human and animal muscle, and also what has been called the exosomatic sources of energy, whether fossilized or renewable, that power machines. Equally important, labor relies on general environmental conditions, on breathable air, potable water, fertile soil, relatively stable sea levels, a habitable climate. Finally, nature is the setting and site, as I've said, of the communities and societies that live from and organize labor. It is their habitat and meaning-laden place of social interaction, their means of livelihood, the material basis of their reproduction. Absent nature, there is no society, hence no social labor. Nature and labor, in sum, form a couple, although we could also add in community and therefore make a throuple. All of this is what Marx had in mind when he called, in phrasing that is perhaps a bit unfortunate, man's inorganic body. The point is right, terminology aside. We only forget this, I suggest, because capitalist society has sharply separated human labor from non-human nature. Dispossessed of its inorganic body, labor is cut off from the natural conditions of its exercise, which are confiscated by capital and made into the latter's private property. Hived off from non-human nature, most obviously, but not only land, labor is impoverished, rendered naked, and merely subjective. no longer a moment of the larger complex that also encompasses nature. Labor power appears as a thing unto itself, separate and commodifiable. And the labor movements that claim to represent the bearers of it seem to be quite separate from the environmental movements that claim to represent nature. Effectively divided from one another, the two sets of movements are weakened. Their interests appear to conflict. In the zero-sum metrics of capitalism, labor's interests depend on jobs, which themselves depend on profitable investment opportunities, which depend, in turn, on capital's freedom to take what it wants from nature with little or no obligation to replenish or repair. In this scenario, labor's interests appear directly opposed to nature's interests, if we can speak that way. But that, I'm suggesting, is false. The structurally implanted illusion of a perverse social system. The truth is that any movement that truly stands for the cause of labor must be green, committed to sustaining and repairing nature. And conversely, any movement for sustaining and repairing nature must embrace the cause of labor. Only if each side rediscovers and embraces its other half, so to speak, can we heal the rift introduced by capital between labor and nature. Labor's true complement, then, is not capital, but nature. And nature's true allies are not green capitalists, but labor movements. And I include, under that category of labor movements, feminist movements devoted to the recognition of care work, and anti-racist and anti-imperialist movements dedicated to abolishing subwork. Those are all, in effect, just one second, I want to make sure I'm in the right place here. Yeah. Right, sorry. Okay, so what I've been arguing here then is that capitalism's ecological contradiction cannot be neatly separated from the system's other constitutive irrationalities and injustice. To ignore the latter by adopting the reductive ecologistic perspective of single-issue environmentalism is to miss the distinctive institutional design of capitalist society, dividing economy not only from nature, but also from labor, care work, and racial imperial expropriation. This society institutes a tangle of mutually interacting contradictions which must, I claim, be addressed together. And that brings me then to my second thesis. Ecopolitics should not only be anti-capitalist, but also trans-environmental, that is linked to struggles against harms and injustices that may initially appear to have nothing to do with environmentalism. Both those ideas gain support when we turn to capitalism's history. In its earliest mercantilist conquistador phase, which spanned the 16th through 18th centuries, agriculture and manufacturing ran mainly on wind, water, and animal muscle, human and otherwise, just as they had for millennia. Thus, the only way to augment available energy was by annexing land and commandeering additional supplies of labor. Mercantile capitalist powers did just that, with a vengeance, in both the so-called New World and the Old. In the system's periphery, they installed brutal systems of socio-ecological extractivism, working land and labor to the point of exhaustion and leaving trails of environmental and social wreckage across whole continents. In the system's core regions, they forcibly enclosed common lands, dispossessed tenants and farmers of customary use rights, and upended the life worlds of rural populations. In both cases, those on the receiving end fought back. Aiming to counter wholesale assaults on habitats, communities, and livelihoods, their resistance was necessarily integrative, combining what we would now call environmental struggles with struggles over labor, social reproduction, and political power. These were environmentalisms of the poor. The mercantilist order gave way in the early 19th century to liberal colonial capitalism. It was in this period that English mill owners pioneered the world historic shift to fossil energy, which appeared to liberate forces of production from the constraints of land and labor. But this appearance was illusory. Industrialization in the core rested on extractivism in the periphery. What made Manchester's factories hum was the massive import of cheap coal to feed the steam engines, cheap cotton to feed the mills, cheap sugar, tobacco, coffee, and tea to stimulate the hands, cheap bird shit to feed the soil that fed the workers, all produced by enslaved or dependent gang labor, which was in turn produced by cheap and often coerced reproductive labor. So the apparent savings of labor and land was actually a form of environmental load displacement, that is, a shift in the demands placed on biomass from core to periphery, including the periphery within Europe and North America, above all the enslaved South, slave South. Theorists and historians of eco-imperialism are only now reckoning the full extent of this cost shifting, while also revealing the close connection of anti-slavery and anti-colonialism with proto-environmentalism. Struggles against peripheral predation in the liberal colonial era were also environmentalisms of the poor. In the capitalist core, however, proto-environmentalism looked somewhat different. The Romantics conceived nature as sublime and beyond price, worthy of reverence and protection. Their perspective fed conservative critiques of industrial society and eventually standalone environmentalisms of the rich, which focused on wilderness protection. Although it is often thought to exhaust the whole of proto-environmentalism in this era, this approach coexisted in reality with another perspective, which linked capitalist assault on nature with class injustice. Key proponents of that second perspective were William Morris and Friedrich Engels, who together seeded rich traditions of socialist ecology, which were subsequently obscured by narrow single-issue understandings of environmentalism, but which are now being recovered and extended. At the start of the 20th century, liberal colonial capitalism gave way to a new state-organized or state-managed form led by the United States. Centered on the internal combustion engine and refined oil, this regime orchestrated a vast expansion of greenhouse gas emissions. But the US also begat a powerful environmental movement. One current centered on wilderness protection through the creation of reserves and national parks, usually by means of indigenous displacement. This was, to be sure, an environmentalism of the rich, which enabled some Americans to escape industrial civilization temporarily, but which neither confronted that civilization nor sought to transform it. Another current targeted the industrial nucleus of the regime and pushed for state action to curtail corporate pollution. Its efforts culminated in 1970 with the creation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which taxed the petroleum and chemical industry to fund efforts to clean up toxic waste sites on US territory. That approach, which it's hard to even remember now, was known as polluter pays, and it was much more progressive than current carbon trading schemes, which substitute the carrot for the stick and work through markets. Yet, state capitalist regulation of nature, or of capital's relation to nature, I should say, was built on more disavowed cost shifting, unloading eco-externalities disproportionately onto poor communities, especially communities of color in the core, while ramping up extractivism and environmental load displacement in the periphery. Now, beginning in the 1970s, this state-managed, or if you like, social democratic capitalism, gradually gave way to the present regime of neoliberal financialized capitalism. This regime has relocated much manufacturing to the global south, while leaving the global north to specialize in the so-called post-material triad of IT services and finance. But of course, northern post-materialism rests, yet again, on southern materialism, mining, agriculture, manufacturing, as well as on fracking and offshore drilling in its own backyard, and as well as on the super exploitation of its own working class with the restructuring of labor markets here. Equally important, consumption in the global north is ever more carbon intensive. Witness steep rises in air travel, meat-eating cement paving, and now energy-devouring data centers, all of which drive increased material throughput. Under these conditions, the grammar of eco-politics is shifting. As global heating has displaced chemical pollution as the central issue, so markets in emissions permits and offsets have supplanted coercive state power as the go-to regulatory mechanism. The international has replaced the national as the favored area of eco-governance. Environmental activism has altered too. The wilderness protection current has weakened and split, with one branch gravitating to the green capitalist power center, the other to increasingly assertive movements for environmental justice. These latter now encompass a broad range of subaltern actors, from southern environmentalisms of the poor, resisting enclosures and land grabs, to northern anti-racists targeting disparities in exposure to toxins, to indigenous movements fighting pipelines, to ecofeminists battling deforestation. At the same time, populist revolts, both left and right, have shattered belief in the magical properties of so-called free markets. This has led, on one side, to a return to the view that national state power can serve as a vehicle of eco-societal reform. Just witness the revival of the idea of a Green New Deal. Also, nope, that's not the right page, sorry. This double-sided thing is environmentally good, but cognitively confusing. Okay. Yeah, Green New Dealers and labor unions, long committed to defending the occupational health and safety of their members, but wary of curbs on development, are now looking increasingly to green infrastructure projects to create jobs. But the same dynamics have also led, as I said at the outset, to a global resurgence of climate denialism in the guise of a new right-wing fossil populism. Now, in this context, as I said before, some are tempted to construct a green big tent encompassing environmentalism from below and green capital. But that, I'm arguing here, would be a mistake for several reasons. First of all, on the plane of theory, I've showed or tried to show that capitalism harbors a deep-seated ecological contradiction that inclines it non-accidentally to environmental crisis. And second, that those dynamics are inextricably entwined with other non-environmental crisis tendencies and cannot be resolved in isolation from them. Now, on the plane of history, I've tried to show that ecological questions have actually rarely been neatly separated from questions of political power, gender and racial oppression, imperial domination, indigenous dispossession, and even genocide, nor from questions of livelihood, community, and social reproduction. and that struggles over nature have been deeply entangled with struggles over labor, care, race, and political power in every phase of capitalist development. Single-issue environmentalism is historically exceptional and politically problematic, in part because it flies in the face of reality. The environment cannot be protected without transforming the institutional design and structural dynamics of capitalist society. There is no other way to save the planet. But that conclusion is also supported by my third type of argument, which is an argument about political strategy. Given the scale and configuration of the forces against us, there is no way to save the planet without engaging the energies and support of those large populations where, I did it again, wait a minute, where pressing existential concerns let me start that sentence again. It's a complicated sentence, too complicated. There is no way to save the planet without engaging the energies and support of those large populations whose pressing existential concerns do not appear to them at first sight to be connected to environmental degradation. To reach those people, movements to save the planet must be, again, trans-environmental. Taken together, these two propositions, anti-capitalism, trans-environmentalism, connect the dots. By linking environmental harms to harms of class, race, gender, sexuality, and empire, all rooted in one and the same social system, they supply a basis for coordinated struggles against it. The effect is to draw the line necessary to every counter-hegemonic or historical bloc between us and them. Unmasking carbon trading for the scam that it is, the approach I propose pushes every potentially emancipatory current of eco-politics to publicly disaffiliate not only from fossil populism, but also from green capitalism. It pushes each current, too, to pay heed to its own Achilles heel. For example, its inclination to avoid confronting capital, whether by pursuing illusory delinking, as in the case of degrowth, or by pursuing what can only be a lopsided class compromise, as in the case of Green New Deal, or by pursuing what must end as tragic parity in extreme vulnerability in the case of environmental justice pursued in a decontextualized way. Moreover, the pairing of trans-environmentalism with anti-capitalism indicates a path that partisans of degrowth, environmental justice, and a Green New Deal can travel together, joining not only with one another, but also with labor movements, feminist movements, anti-racist and anti-imperialist movements, movements for peace and human rights. Where exactly such a historical bloc would take us, were it to be seen, remains to be seen. But if I had to give the goal, if I had to name the goal, I'd call it eco-socialism. And if I were pressed to envision its design, I'm at a design school after all, I'd turn to William Morris, who was not only a designer of beautiful, if dated-looking wallpaper, but also a revolutionary eco-socialist and the rare Marxist who was not content merely to criticize capitalism, but who also dared to venture some views about the design of what should replace it. But that, alas, is the topic for another lecture. Thanks very much for your attention. So I'm happy to take questions, and I know there are microphones around. So I'm just going to call on people from where I sit. You're the first person I see here, and I'm looking for other hands.
Thank you very much for your illuminating talk. I very much agree with everything you said, and in particular with the fact that there is no contradictions between labor struggles and environmental struggles, at least at a certain level of abstraction. However, in practice, there are some contradictions. And just to take one example, whoever here in this room has a stake in a pension fund has in fact no interest in really changing that, and that's the case of many workers at different levels. So how do we overcome these practical contradictions? Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. It's a highly germane and important question. I think that the question it has to do with what background conditions, what sort of baselines you're using for talking about interests and contradictions of interest. That is certainly the way the current social system, right, arrays our interest in just that sort of contradiction. But if you have a pension fund, you might also have heirs, children, grandchildren, whomever. And so if you start sort of widening your sense of what the frame within which you calculate your interests are, widening it temporally, perhaps spatially, and also enriching it qualitatively. Really, what good is all that money going to do if in 30 years we're just off the cliff? So the issue is how eco-political actors frame the choices, the trade-offs. There are certainly trade-offs. I would never deny that. But how they're framed matters. And right now, we have this sort of economistic framing of everything in terms of what are the monetary trade-offs. And that's increasingly, glaringly inadequate given what we're facing. So difficult. Nothing I've said, and Dean Whiting emphasized this in her introduction, nothing I've said here is meant to suggest that it would be easy to kind of, try to make the kind of change I think is necessary. But I hope that by laying out a framework that can show the inadequacy of the sort of ideological common sense through which we usually think about these things, I hope that by doing that we can at least open the discussion, and then you have these collective action problems, which if more people think that others might be in there with them, then it's worth maybe saying, well, my pension fund, we'll find some other way to guarantee a rich and comfortable old age for people. We'll have to find another way to do that for everybody. I'm looking for another hand, but yes, thank you. Alyssa. Whoops.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering, I really loved your formulation when you were talking about how labor's ally is nature rather than capital. I feel like that's a really powerful image and not one that we usually think about when we speak about labor movements. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe elaborate a bit more on that, and if you could talk about examples maybe in which if you have seen labor movements allying with nature successfully, what that might look like. And maybe this question is more for us to think about also, because I'm curious about architectural labor in particular, given that architectural labor, generally architects are not necessarily considered, like a working class labor movement inclined set of workers, and yet most people who work in architecture work in firms, are not firm owners, et cetera. So, there are laborers in architecture, right. And not even to mention the trades, right? Of course. So there there's just a huge element of architectural labor that also is completely captured by the interests of capital. And so I'm interested in that problem as well, and interested what that would look like to recognize the alliance that we owe to nature in that case. And I think we understand that in school, we understand that materials come from nature, et cetera, but once we're in the workplace, those connections are harder to make. So I'm wondering if you might have reflections on that.
Thank you. So these are really interesting comments, Alyssa. You know, the first thing I thought of when you asked for examples is just this sort of alter globalization Seattle, right, slogan, Teamsters and turtles together at last, you know. But that was kind of beautiful, actually. I don't think it actually happened, but probably more examples would come from the environmentalism of the poor thing, where these things are not so sharply separated to begin with. But there are, albeit few and not so dramatic, local union locals in cities that are involved in green stuff, and some in rural areas as well. But this needs to be really scaled up. We don't have dramatic examples, at least not in the US. In terms of architectural labor, I guess part of what, one way to think about this is who are you designing for, who are you building for? And of course, I suppose that architects don't have too many options besides building for capital, designing for capital. But just think like in the New Deal, for example, it may not have all been beautiful, but look at all the public construction that was done. So one should think about the public sector. I think I'm not an anarchist at all. I think an eco-socialist society will need a big public sector because it should be providing a lot of for basic needs in the form of public goods as opposed to commodities, healthcare, and so on. So just think of everything that would be there to be built or retrofitted or repurposed or whatever. I think without knowing much about your field at all, I think that this would be very interesting. And we talked in your class about what it would mean to think about if care work were really seen as essential, socially necessary, and valued activity on a par with making widgets or whatever else we need to make. You know, how would we think about redesigning cities, the home office, home factory nexus, and so on. So shopping, you know. I think there's a huge amount of work to be done. And I mean, I mentioned Morris because he's really one of the few people I've come across in the Marxian tradition who, well, there's some Bolshevik feminists who were thinking all about how to have design buildings for collective living and child care and so on. But Morris was one of the few people who had a very strong, I would say, green, proto-environmentalist idea that how important it was to think of a society in which work, sociality, living space, conviviality was all really very much cited in relation to the natural habitat and made beautiful and enjoyable. So. Yes. Oh, sorry.
So go next, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this talk and for the work that you've done throughout your career.
My question is an elaboration one. Could you say more about what you're seeing as the delinking is happening in the degrowth analysis or degrowth movements? And in addition to this, I'm curious, because your language of trans-environmental, usually when we think about something like degrowth, part of it is we'll need to scale back our habits of consumption. But I'm wondering how your language might also have applicability to how the desire also needs to be rearranged, not only at the point of consumption, but across other locuses. Right. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Right. Yeah. I don't like the language of degrowth, or I think growth is exactly the wrong word to be using here, because it's like a quantitative word. And growth of what? Growth of capital, that's the main thing our system makes grow, in addition to waste and wreckage. That we don't want to degrow, we want to literally abolish, in my view. But things that can be made sustainably through enjoyable and positive work contexts that satisfy human needs, basic needs, which exist on a scale unmet across this globe that is really horrific. So we can't talk about degrowing that, right? Yeah. So I don't like the word, but I think politically, that's a conceptual point. Politically, it's exactly the wrong message. Make do with less. This is what it means to people who are not schooled in eco-theory. That's exactly the wrong message. That's vulnerable to the elite beliefs critique, right? People who don't have to worry about, who have plenty, and I guess the last thing about that, though, I want to, but say what I like about many thinkers who call themselves degrowth thinkers is that they are, despite the language they're using, they are trying to talk about the qualitative, not just the quantitative. And we need to talk about, what is a beautiful, satisfying, form of life. It has to be just and democratic and so on. That goes without saying. But qualitatively, what kinds of social relations, what kinds of spaces, what kinds of institutional arrangements? And this is where I think Morris was trying to go, and we need to go. And probably the people sitting in this audience are much better placed to think about those questions than I am. I'm like a specialist in criticism. You guys are going to be the specialists in, imagining the alternative. Yeah, and trans-environmental, I sort of worried that movements for trans rights might feel I was ripping off their word or something. I hope that's not the case. But I can't think of a better way, at least now, to say that it's not about, it's about those maybe transversal is the word I want maybe, but that just doesn't sound right, transversal. And anyway, it's about those connections that are already tangled up together anyway, but that are hived off in the normal siloed way in which we think and organize ourselves politically. There was a question way in the back, and then
I think I'm next. We're going to move up this way because also the dean has a question. But thanks, Nancy.
I'm sorry. Who's speaking? I can't.
I'm speaking right down here.
Oh,
right down here.
Diane. Hi.
Yeah. Hi.
Couldn't locate you.
No, thanks for this brilliant lecture. I wanted to pick up a little bit on your response to Alyssa about, and just pull us back to the discussion of eco-socialism.
Yeah.
Because also, in answer to several of the question so far, you've used the word scale. So we're a school, and we work at very many scales. From the building scale to the block scale to the city scale, there's regional scale, et cetera. And I would love to hear your thoughts as a philosopher, and, you know, a critic of capitalism and a strong supporter of like revolutionary change for eco-socialism, and I'm with you in all those things. What's the scale of action?
Good.
That where, how do we, it's a different thing than building a house or in a small community, even when Morris was thinking, because we're talking about a problem that's a planetary problem, and the sources of what is destroying the globe and the environment do not stop at a political boundary. At any scale, from the neighborhood to the city to the state to the nation to the globe. So where should we be thinking? I mean, I think that, or do you have any examples of cross-scale of thinking? Because that's, I think, a potential that we can do here at the GSD, work at multiple scales similarly. So that's my question.
Thank you. So basically, for me, the problem is not to like think about, okay, what's the right scale and choose your scale. For me, the problem is that people fight wherever they are about whatever in their lives they can't tolerate. And the question is not to say, no, you're at the wrong scale. The question is to use that metaphor I used before, to connect the dots. So there was a word, that kind of an ugly word that was coined a while ago called the glocal, you know, where and that everything starts locally, except for, you know, the real elites who are the cosmopolitan, you know, global ruling class. Okay, they have, you know, 10 homes and who knows where they are. It's not local. But for everybody else, the starting point is local, and no activist, thinker, politician calls that energy into being. The conditions call it into being. People bring it into being. But what happens to it? Does it remain disconnected? Is it entrenched or limited by a mindset that thinks that those people over there are eating our cats and dogs, and we're not going to have anything to do with them? We're going to have to get rid of them. You know, what's the larger narrative, the larger frame? And a lot of these you know, the most easily available large narratives and frames for dot connecting that we have are pretty horrible. Not all, but a lot of the most powerful ones, the ones that get taken up the most, are very bad. And so I think the issue is making available alternative maps of how where you are in your local place is connected to all these other things that seem disconnected from you, but are actually, you know, once you start pulling some threads in the fabric, you see that they are connected, and that could shift the sense of who are my allies. I might decide the mine owner is not my real ally. It's the migrant laborer is my real ally, you know?
So I had a similar question about scale. I think, and maybe you're getting at the answer there, because you have William Morris, you hold up.
Yeah.
The New Deal you've mentioned. You jumped over 70s democratic socialism a little quickly before it became consumed by neoliberal capitalism. But I wonder if the difference, a sort of aspiration to be able to go back to any one of those moments, which seems to have promise in some form of collective positive action, I wonder if you're getting at that now with the possibility of, through different means of communication, we can actually reveal the larger implications that go beyond the local, which each one of those movements, I mean, the New Deal is more national, but those movements, those periods were defined in scale. And can we actually use forms of communication or forms of action that can exceed scale to make visible those connections or create new connections, as you're talking about? It seems that communication or some form of media would be tied to actually getting beyond where we are right now through your lens.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the comment, the question. Yeah, I don't mean to hold up the New Deal or I mean, if I had to actually give an example, I'm interrupting myself. If I had to give an example of a sort of a multi or trans or cross-scalar thing, I think I would say Chiapas, because that was like at one and the same time a fight against like feudal, oppression in a region. It was a fight for real incorporation and citizenship rights in the Mexican state. It was a fight against American corporate investment. It was it was connected up with the world. So I mean, that was an amazing moment where somehow these activists were able to make all these links, and so they could invite people to enter at different scales, and in each case expand their own horizons as a thinking. So that would be the kind of example. And the means of communication are obviously crucial. And of course, that's a huge mixed bag. I've had so many conversations here with people about the attention commodity, data mining, all of that stuff. And we could even talk about the effects of social media on, the New York Times is running a million stories about, how it's ruining young people's minds and creating mass depression and so on and so forth. Whether this is hyped or true or not, I'm not in a position to know. But there's so many negatives here, and yet, activists do use media and do manage to participate across vast distances together in conversations. So I think probably high on the agenda would be to, socialize the ownership of the means of communication. That's let's say a long-term goal. But yeah, let's try to take it over somehow. I don't know.
Thank you so much for this presentation, Professor Fraser. My name is Jacek. I'm one of the Loeb Fellows here, and I want to express my gratitude to everyone who welcomed you and brought you here, because I feel like we really need the trans-environmental push in the disciplines that we deal with. And I love the term transversal environmentalism, by the way, and I think you should keep working on it. There is this moment in your presentation when you were flipping the pages and you said that it was environmentally friendly but cognitively confusing. And I feel like this phrase really encapsulated a lot of issues out there, which is basically this observation that a lot of changes that we have to fight for in terms of environmental consciousness require cognitive rewiring and reprogramming. And I'm here with my daughter, who is 7 years old. Her name is Simone. And she could speak for herself, but I would love her to become an eco-socialist in the future. So my question on behalf of my daughter is how to do that.
How to do it? I don't know. I'm not sure it's a thing that you have a method for.
Yeah, but
I think it's just read, think, look around you, talk to people. I don't know.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking about this cognitive reprogramming, right?
Yeah,
I feel like some of us, I might be like in a situation where it will be more and more difficult for me to do that cognitive reprogramming. But with the young generation, it might be easier. So I'm just like speaking to that idea. How can we translate these quite complex ideas to a language that can be not
Right.
just understood, but also, applied by the
Right.
young generation.
Yeah. So, of course, I'm, a sort of philosophically trained, analytic, all the arguments and blah, blah, blah. This is not the way for, I did do one piece of more agitational writing, the first one since I was a real agitator in the 1960s, and that's my co-authored book with Cinzia Ruzza and Tithi Bhattacharya, Feminism for the 99%. And what I always thought, and what the three of us said, was that we want, I don't mean to sound like we think we're so great, but we want other social movements to copy this. Why doesn't somebody write environmentalism for the 99%, anti-racism for the 99%, LGBTQ for the 99%, et cetera, et cetera? Because like feminism, all of these movements, drift, especially in this country. The inertia drags you into a kind of liberal, legalistic, formal rights framework. And it's a struggle to resist that and, have a more, I'll use all these old-fashioned words, structural, materialist, et cetera, paradigms. But I think that the times are meeting us halfway. What's happening is horrible, but I love how young people are radicalizing. This is a moment that is intellectually exciting for me, even though it is otherwise devastating. And people, it's the same process by which some people become, white Christian nationalists. They've had enough of the way things are, and they're thinking outside the box. And the more people like us are able to put out there that is not white Christian nationalism. Here's another way to think outside the box. You're right, it can't go on like this. And I think that there is such a explosion of creative work in eco-Marxism, eco-socialism, eco-feminism, and all sorts of things that it's a great moment to be an intellectual, a left-wing intellectual.
Thank you, Nancy, for your talk. I'm Andy Summers. I'm also one of the Loeb Fellows. I'm your liaison for tomorrow, so I look forward to picking you up for dinner. A question is that it appears on the left, in relation to allyship and working with other people, that one might have to agree 100% on worldviews in relation to agreeing on a position on Gaza, on Ukraine, support for transgender people, support for equal marriage. And if one doesn't then support or agree on those worldviews, well, we will not work together for progressive change.
Right.
Where on the right, we might disagree 98% on worldviews, but if we agree on 2%, then we will see that and we will work together to attack that particular issue. And I'm just wondering, what do you think about that? Because obviously these opinions and beliefs are deeply held. And how might we begin to explore ways where allyship might be a bit more agile on an issue-by-issue basis in relation to making progress? Because I feel that in lots of areas of civil life that we are regressing and falling behind.
Thank you. Can I just start by expressing a little bit of unease about the term allyship? I know that this is a widely used term now, but I guess it was quite a while ago, maybe a good year ago, I listened to Keeanga-Yamada Taylor, who is someone I strongly appreciate, say, it's not about allyship, it's about like counter-hegemony, or I don't think she used that word, but the point is, you won't hold together a powerful coalition if you're fighting for someone else out of like moral selflessness. You have to be fighting for yourself. And you have to be, I don't mean that in a selfish way, but you have to have an existential stake and think that this is, I'm not like doing something for those poor people over there. I'm doing something for us and for, you know, our whole way of life, and if I live long enough, for a better life for myself. So that's just a small point. Now, I think there are two different issues here, and I want to deal first with the easy one. The easy one is, do you want to be sectarian or not? The answer to that is you don't know. I mean sectarian in the sense, like, do I want to insist that everyone in that I'm sort of, you know, allied with, in that other sense of allied, has to already be a full, you know, bore communist of some kind? No. I mean, my idea, I once used a phrase, with apologies to Gayatri Stiva, strategic agnosticism, meaning that I myself believe that you're not going to get any of the stuff we want while it's still capitalism, but I'm not insisting that everyone sign on to that, or because it's not. I mean, to me, if capitalism could do everything I want, I would say hats off. Okay, fine. I don't care what we call it. You know what I'm saying? So I don't want to get hung up on words, even though when I speak in a theoretical vein, I'm giving you my best, strongest theoretical argument why it has to be anti-capitalist. But am I going to say I won't work with anyone who's a mere social democrat? If they want the same things I want, we'll see how it plays out. I think that I'll be right, and they will have to become an anti. But I can't insist on that now. You know what I mean? Strategic agnosticism. But the harder question that you raise is not about whether we share the same terminology or picture of what the end state is, but what we do with people who are with us on some issues and not on others, and not in a way that is, you know, very problematic from my point of view or our point of view. And I think that, I mean, I've tried to make the argument that you can't start out with the idea, as Hillary Clinton famously put it, that all the MAGA people are just a basket of deplorables. I think you have to start out with the idea that these are suffering people who have gotten hooked up with really bad ideas, and some of them might be irredeemable, some of them might be principled racists. Others, though, are opportunistic racists. You know, they voted for Obama at first, then they voted for Trump, then they voted for Sanders, then when Sanders was off the ballot. You know, this is a time of tremendous flux. It's like the 1930s, where the same people voted communist in one election in Germany and Nazi in the next. And it's really, you have to start with a sense of volatility and craziness, and, you know, give people the chance to evolve, to develop. Validate the grievance. You are right to be angry about XYZ, but, you know, it's not really the fault of trans people or, you know, feminist career women or, you know, whatever, the scapegoat du jour. So I'm not saying you want to be at a march where someone is literally carrying a sign or holding up a big banner, you know, go Israel, crush those bastards, you know. But I think one has to actually try to woo people rather than cut them off at the knee somehow. That's my answer.
Thank you. Thank you for a thought-provoking lecture. The last two questions and your last two answers have started crystallizing the two issues that I would like to ask you about. Mm-hmm. And these are two dimensions that sort of like pop up in your talk, but they're not fully articulated, and I wonder if you can help us in articulating them. The first, is there a moral dimension to your argument? And by that question, I mean, you brought William Morris, and William Morris is one out of a bunch of thinkers who were reacting to early capitalism and industrialism, and many of them returned to religion and found in religion a moral refuge that they could use, or they could use its ability to bring people together.
Yeah.
And the second dimension, and it's actually interrelated, is also something that you mentioned. You said the 1% and the 99%, but I want to widen it a little bit and think globally. That is, the 99% who are not represented in your epistemological framework, not in your caring for them. And my question to you is that, do you think there are traditions of thoughts outside of the Western tradition that are making advances in environmentalist thinking? I'm thinking of the Buddhist and the Islamic traditions, about which I'm a little bit informed, that are actually making very fresh arguments about how we deal with the environmental crisis that we are in. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you. Those are two really interesting points. Is there a moral dimension? Well, you know, as a trained philosopher in the United States and the Anglo-analytic tradition with all of that baggage, so the first thing I have to say is that in this tradition we distinguish between the moral and the ethical. The moral is Kant, and it's you know, it's kind of you know, the universal categorical imperative. You don't pay any. It cashes out into sort of distributive justice. Who has how much of what? And distributive justice is hugely important, but it's not that qualitative question. And that's where ethics comes in. What are the values as opposed to morality? Think Aristotle, where what is the good life? What is the good, the telos that human life is supposed to aim at? Now, those questions are complicated because there's so many possible good answers as well as some bad answers, I think. And so all kinds of traditions, right? You mentioned Buddhism, but many other Western, non-Western, and all the different religious communities, even within the West, have different, you know, slightly different, or maybe hugely different views about these questions of value. These are both extremely interesting, but also hard to mediate. And I think the trick is to think about, where can you say, let 100 flowers bloom, let this community have that ethical, you know, spiritual identity, and this one have that? And where do you say that, no, we also need some common overarching, I sound like Rawls, don't I? Something that overarches the different comprehensive doctrines, because we are dealing with problems that are very large scale, as well as those that have specific local expressions and so on. So, yeah. Look, I have a what do you call it? I'm deaf to religious. You know, it's a tin ear for it. So I can't give you a really good answer. But I've seen in my life and in history religious communities in which the spiritual element plays an extremely positive role, as well as those in which it plays a murderous, genocidal, horrific role. So there's obviously not one size fits all kind of answer to that. Yeah, I think that's as much as I can say about those two questions, which are good questions.
I think we're at time, but I really appreciate. I think the questions were very probing, very hard, but really helpful, and I think what you gave us is very special. So I want to join everyone in saying thank you.
Thank you.